In 1871, a German explorer named Karl Mach stumbled upon massive stone walls rising from the African landscape like ancient skyscrapers. The structures were so sophisticated, so precisely engineered, that he immediately declared they couldn't possibly have been built by Africans. He was convinced he'd found the legendary palace of the Queen of Sheba. He was spectacularly wrong. What Mach had discovered was Great Zimbabwe, a medieval African city that housed 18,000 people at its peak, controlled gold trade routes across half the continent, and featured architectural techniques that European engineers wouldn't master for another 200 years. But for over a century, the racist assumptions of colonial archaeologists buried the truth about Africa's most magnificent medieval achievement. If you're ready to have everything you thought you knew about medieval Africa completely shattered, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're about to uncover the most suppressed architectural mystery in human history. By the end of this video, you'll discover how medieval Africans built stone cities without mortar that have stood for 800 years. Why Great Zimbabwe controlled more wealth than most European kingdoms. And how colonial racism nearly erased one of humanity's greatest civilizations from history books. This isn't just the story of impressive buildings. It is the untold history of medieval Africa's golden age, where master architects created engineering marvels. International trade networks connected Africa to China and India, and a sophisticated civilization thrived while Europe was still emerging from the Dark Ages. The truth about Great Zimbabwe will change everything you think you know about medieval Africa. And the reason it was hidden will shock you even more. The year was 1871, and Karl Mach stood before walls that defied everything he believed about African civilization. These were uncrewed huts or simple fortifications. They were precisely engineered stone structures rising 30 feet into the air, built with techniques that seemed impossibly advanced for what he considered a primitive continent. But Mach's response reveals more about Victorian prejudice than historical truth. Rather than acknowledging African architectural achievement, he spun elaborate theories attributing Great Zimbabwe to anyone except indigenous Africans, Phoenicians, Arabs, biblical Israelites, even extraterrestrials. The possibility that medieval Africans could have built these magnificent structures was literally unthinkable within his racist worldview. The archaeological evidence, however, told a completely different story. Pottery fragments, iron tools, gold artifacts, and carbon dating would eventually prove that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the modern Shona people between 1100 and 1450 CE. This wasn't foreign conquest or outside influence. It was indigenous African architectural genius at its peak. The site itself sprawls across nearly 1,800 acres, making it larger than many European medieval cities. The Great Enclosure, the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara, contains walls up to 36 feet high and 20 feet thick at the base. These walls were built using a dry stone technique that required no mortar, yet they've survived African storms, earthquakes, and 8 centuries of weathering with minimal damage. The precision of Great Zimbabwe's construction becomes even more impressive when examined in detail. The stones were carefully selected and shaped to fit together perfectly, creating walls that lean slightly inward for stability while maintaining their imposing height. Drainage systems were integrated into the design to handle Zimbabwe's intense rainy seasons. The curves and angles of the walls follow natural contours while creating acoustically perfect spaces for gathering and ceremony. Archaeological excavations have revealed a complex urban center with distinct residential areas, religious precincts, royal quarters, and commercial districts. The hill complex, perched on a granite outcrop, served as the spiritual and administrative heart of the city. The valley complex housed the general population in stone houses that were far more sophisticated than contemporary European peasant dwellings. The timeline of Great Zimbabwe's development spans over 400 years. with distinct architectural phases showing increasing sophistication and scale. Early construction dating to 1100 CE shows experimental techniques and smaller structures. By 1300 CE, the builders had mastered their craft, creating the massive walls and complex layouts that still amaze visitors today. The final phase, ending around 1450 CE, represents the pinnacle of their architectural achievement. But the colonial interpretation of Great Zimbabwe wasn't just academic error, it was deliberate, historical suppression designed to justify racist ideologies. If Africans could build magnificent stone cities, control vast trade networks, and create sophisticated civilizations, then colonial claims about African primitiveness became untenable. The myth of Great Zimbabwe as a foreign creation was essential for maintaining European supremacist narratives. The damage done by these false theories was enormous. For decades, archaeologists literally destroyed evidence that contradicted their preconceptions. Artifacts proving African origin were discarded or ignored. Local oral histories preserving accurate information about the site's builders were dismissed as unreliable folklore. The systematic erasure of Great Zimbabwe's true history represents one of archaeology's greatest scandals. The Rhodesian government, named after Cecil Rhodes, went so far as to legally ban archaeological theories attributing Great Zimbabwe to indigenous Africans. Scientists who published research proving African origins faced career destruction and government persecution. The official tourist guidebooks promoted the Queen of Sheba theory well into the 1970s, decades after archaeological evidence had definitively disproven it. Modern archaeological techniques have vindicated what local communities always knew. Great Zimbabwe was built by their ancestors using indigenous African architectural traditions that can be traced back thousands of years. Similar dry stone construction techniques appear throughout the region in earlier sites, showing clear developmental continuity rather than sudden foreign introduction. The recovery of Great Zimbabwe's true history began in the 1960s with African archaeologists like Peter Garlake, who conducted systematic excavations free from colonial bias. Their work revealed not just African origins, but African architectural innovation that influenced building traditions across southern and eastern Africa. Great Zimbabwe wasn't an isolated achievement, but the culmination of centuries of indigenous architectural development. The international significance of Great Zimbabwe extends far beyond its impressive architecture. The site provides crucial evidence for understanding medieval African urbanism, trade networks, political organization, and technological innovation. It demonstrates that medieval Africa possessed sophisticated civilizations comparable to contemporary societies in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Understanding the discovery and suppression of Great Zimbabwe reveals how archaeological interpretation has been distorted by racism and colonial ideology. The willingness of supposedly objective scientists to create elaborate fantasy theories rather than acknowledge African achievement shows how deeply prejudice can corrupt academic research and historical understanding. Stand before the great enclosure's towering walls at sunrise, and you'll witness one of humanity's most remarkable engineering achievements. These aren't just piles of stones, they precision engineered structures that demonstrate mastery of architectural principles that would appear in European construction for centuries. Every stone was carefully selected, shaped, and positioned according to sophisticated mathematical and engineering knowledge that challenges everything we thought we knew about medieval African capabilities. The dry stone construction technique used at Great Zimbabwe represents one of the world's most advanced building methods, without using any mortar, cement, or binding agents. The builders created walls that have stood for 800 years in a climate that regularly produces devastating storms, floods, and seismic activity. This wasn't primitive construction. It was architectural engineering at its most sophisticated. The secret lies in the precise selection and placement of granite blocks. The builders quarried stones from nearby granite formations, choosing pieces that would fit together like three-dimensional puzzles. Each stone had to support the weight above it while distributing loads to the stones below and beside it. The slightest miscalculation could cause catastrophic wall collapse. Yet Great Zimbabwe's walls remain structurally sound after 8 centuries. The wall construction follows complex geometric principles that create both strength and beauty. The bases are massive, up to 20 feet thick, providing stable foundations for the towering heights above. As the walls rise, they gradually taper and curve inward, creating a subtle architectural grace while improving structural stability. The curves aren't random, but follow mathematical principles that distribute weight optimally and resist both wind pressure and seismic forces. The most impressive architectural feature is the chevron pattern decorating the tops of many walls. These aren't merely decorative elements, but functional architectural details that serve multiple purposes. The chevrons help shed rainwater while adding structural rigidity to the wall tops. They also create acoustic effects that amplify sounds within the enclosures while muffling external noise, turning the stone spaces into natural amphitheaters perfect for ceremonies and gatherings. The drainage systems integrated throughout Great Zimbabwe demonstrate sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering. The builders created channels, gutters, and runoff systems that handle Zimbabwe's intense seasonal rains without undermining the foundations or causing erosion damage. These drainage features were carved directly into bedrock and connected to carefully planned water management systems that supplied the city's population while preventing flood damage. The hill complex showcases perhaps the most advanced architectural achievement at Great Zimbabwe. Built on a steep granite outcrop, these structures required solving complex engineering challenges: how to build on uneven terrain, how to integrate natural rock formations into constructed walls, and how to create level platforms on sloping surfaces. The solutions demonstrate understanding of cantilever construction, load distribution, and foundation engineering that rivals modern techniques. The Valley Complex reveals Great Zimbabwe's builders as master urban planners who understood traffic flow, residential zoning, and public space design. The layout includes wide avenues for ceremonial processions, smaller streets connecting residential areas, and carefully positioned public spaces that could accommodate large gatherings while maintaining privacy for different social groups. This wasn't accidental growth, but planned urban development following sophisticated design principles. The residential architecture within Great Zimbabwe shows attention to comfort and functionality that contradicts stereotypes about medieval African living conditions. Houses featured raised floors for ventilation and moisture control, strategically placed windows for cross breezes, and integrated storage areas for grain and valuables. Many houses included private courtyards and specialized rooms for different activities, far more sophisticated than contemporary European peasant housing. The acoustic engineering throughout Great Zimbabwe demonstrates understanding of sound propagation that would not be formally studied in Europe until centuries later. The curved walls and enclosed spaces create natural amplification systems that allow speakers at specific points to be clearly heard throughout large areas. This acoustic design suggests the spaces were planned for ceremonial and administrative functions requiring clear communication to large audiences. The integration of natural and constructed elements throughout Great Zimbabwe represents one of the site's most remarkable architectural achievements. Rather than fighting against the natural granite landscape, the builders incorporated existing rock formations into their constructions, creating seamless transitions between natural and artificial structures. This integration required precise planning and sophisticated understanding of both geology and structural engineering. The water management systems at Great Zimbabwe reveal advanced understanding of hydrology and environmental engineering. The site includes reservoirs, channels, and distribution systems that collected rainwater, stored it during dry seasons, and supplied the population year-round. These systems were integrated into the architectural design from the beginning, showing comprehensive planning that considered both immediate construction needs and long-term environmental sustainability. The construction timeline reveals how Great Zimbabwe's architecture evolved over centuries, with each generation of builders improving upon previous techniques while maintaining architectural consistency. Early phases show experimental approaches and smaller-scale construction. Middle periods demonstrate refined techniques and larger projects. Final phases represent the pinnacle of achievement, with massive walls and complex layouts that showcase complete mastery of their architectural methods. The influence of Great Zimbabwe's architectural innovations can be traced throughout Eastern and Southern Africa in sites that borrowed and adapted its construction techniques. Similar dry stone construction appears at dozens of related sites, creating a regional architectural tradition that lasted for centuries. This widespread influence demonstrates that Great Zimbabwe wasn't an isolated achievement, but the center of an architectural renaissance that spread across medieval Africa. Modern engineering analysis of Great Zimbabwe's construction has revealed techniques and principles that contemporary architects and engineers find impressive by current standards. Computer modeling shows that the wall designs optimize material usage while maximizing structural strength. The drainage systems demonstrate understanding of water flow dynamics that matches modern hydraulic engineering principles. The acoustic properties achieve effects that require sophisticated calculation and precise construction. Understanding Great Zimbabwe's architecture reveals medieval African engineering capabilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about global technological development. These weren't primitive builders copying foreign techniques, but innovative engineers, developing original solutions to complex construction challenges. Their achievements demonstrate that architectural sophistication existed globally during the medieval period, not just in the civilizations traditionally celebrated in Western historical narratives. Buried beneath Great Zimbabwe's ancient floors, archaeologists have uncovered treasures that tell an extraordinary story. Chinese porcelain from the Ming Dynasty, Persian glass beads, Indian ocean shells, and Arabian coins evidence that this medieval African city controlled trade networks stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This wasn't a remote outpost, but the beating heart of a commercial empire that made its rulers wealthier than most European kings. The foundation of Great Zimbabwe's wealth was gold, lots of it. The surrounding region contained some of Africa's richest gold deposits, and Great Zimbabwe's inhabitants became master miners and metallurgists who could extract, refine, and work gold with techniques that impressed even experienced Arab and Portuguese traders. But they weren't just selling raw materials. They were creating finished gold products that became luxury goods throughout the medieval world. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated gold-working workshops within Great Zimbabwe, where skilled artisans created jewelry, ceremonial objects, and decorative items that combined African artistic traditions with international design influences. Gold wire so fine it resembles thread, intricate filigree work, and complex ceremonial objects demonstrate metalworking skills that rivaled the best craftsmen in medieval Europe or the Islamic world. But gold was just the beginning of Great Zimbabwe's commercial empire. The city also controlled trade in ivory, copper, iron, and exotic animal skins that were prized throughout Asia and Europe. Archaeological excavations have uncovered ivory working workshops, copper smelting facilities, and iron forges that produced both utilitarian tools and luxury items for international export. The trade routes controlled by Great Zimbabwe connected the African interior to Indian Ocean ports, where Arab, Persian, and later Chinese merchants maintained permanent trading posts. Goods from Great Zimbabwe traveled down the Zambezi River system to ports like Sofala and Kilwa, where they were loaded onto dhows and shipped to India, China, Persia, and eventually Europe. The complexity of these trade networks required sophisticated commercial organization that challenges assumptions about medieval African economic systems. Great Zimbabwe's merchants maintained trading relationships across thousands of miles, coordinated seasonal shipping schedules with monsoon winds, and managed currency exchanges between different monetary systems. This wasn't barter trade, but complex commercial finance that rivaled medieval European or Islamic banking systems. The wealth generated by this trade transformed Great Zimbabwe into one of medieval Africa's most prosperous cities. Archaeological evidence shows that ordinary residents owned imported luxury goods, Chinese ceramics for daily use, glass beads for personal adornment, and metal tools that were superior to those available in most of medieval Europe. The elite lived in stone houses decorated with gold ornaments and furnished with luxury goods from across the known world. The political organization required to manage this commercial empire was equally sophisticated. Great Zimbabwe controlled tributary territories across what is now Zimbabwe, Botswana, and South Africa, collecting taxes in gold, ivory, and other valuable commodities. The city maintained diplomatic relationships with coastal trading cities and negotiated commercial agreements with Arab and Persian merchants who provided access to international markets. The agricultural systems supporting Great Zimbabwe reveal another dimension of its economic sophistication. The surrounding region was transformed by intensive farming techniques that supported urban populations while producing surplus crops for trade. Terraced fields, irrigation systems, and crop rotation methods allowed Great Zimbabwe's inhabitants to feed their city while exporting agricultural products to trading partners. The mining operations controlled by Great Zimbabwe were extensive and technologically advanced. Archaeological surveys have identified hundreds of mine shafts, processing facilities, and worker settlements throughout the region. These weren't simple surface mining operations, but deep shaft mines with sophisticated extraction techniques, ore processing systems, and transportation networks that moved raw materials to Great Zimbabwe for refinement and export. The seasonal rhythms of Great Zimbabwe's trade empire were coordinated with monsoon wind patterns that governed Indian Ocean shipping. Merchants had to plan their transactions around weather cycles, coordinating production schedules with shipping seasons to ensure goods reached markets at optimal times. This required understanding of astronomy, meteorology, and international commercial cycles that demonstrates remarkable sophistication. The competition for control of Great Zimbabwe's trade networks was intense and sometimes violent. Portuguese documents from the 16th century describe conflicts between African kingdoms seeking to control gold mines and trade routes. Great Zimbabwe's eventual decline partly resulted from Portuguese interference in established trade relationships and the disruption of centuries-old commercial arrangements. The evidence for Great Zimbabwe's commercial importance comes not just from archaeological finds, but from historical records, maintained by Arab geographers and merchants who describe the city as wealth and importance. Al-Masudi, writing in the 10th century, described the gold trade of the region. Later Arabic sources provide detailed accounts of trading relationships and commercial practices that confirm Great Zimbabwe's central role in Indian Ocean trade. The technological innovations developed to support Great Zimbabwe's trade empire included advanced metallurgy, precision weighing systems, and standardized measurements that allowed for consistent commercial transactions across vast distances. Archaeological finds include bronze weights, measuring devices, and quality control tools that demonstrate systematic approaches to commercial production and trade. The decline of Great Zimbabwe's trade empire in the 15th century coincided with several factors. Climate change that reduced agricultural productivity, Portuguese disruption of established trade routes, and the rise of competing political centers that challenged Great Zimbabwe's commercial dominance. However, the trading networks established by Great Zimbabwe continued to operate for centuries, connecting African producers to international markets through different organizational systems. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe's commercial empire can be traced in modern Zimbabwe's economy, which still depends heavily on gold mining and agricultural exports. Many of the trade routes established by Great Zimbabwe continued to be used throughout the colonial period and remain important transportation corridors today. The commercial relationships established by medieval African merchants laid foundations for economic connections that persist across the Indian Ocean region. Understanding Great Zimbabwe's trade empire reveals medieval Africa as an integral part of global commercial networks rather than an isolated continent. The sophisticated economic systems, international relationships, and technological innovations developed by Great Zimbabwe's merchants demonstrate that medieval Africans were active participants in world trade rather than passive recipients of foreign influence. The wealth and sophistication of Great Zimbabwe's trade empire challenge fundamental assumptions about medieval economic development. This was not a primitive society, gradually awakening to commercial possibilities, but a mature economic system that competed successfully with the most advanced commercial civilizations of its time. The achievements of Great Zimbabwe's merchants deserve recognition alongside the more familiar commercial empires of medieval Europe, Asia, and the Islamic world. Walk through the excavated remains of Great Zimbabwe's residential areas, and you'll discover evidence of a sophisticated society that challenges every stereotype about medieval African life. These weren't simple tribal communities, but complex urban societies with social hierarchies, specialized occupations, elaborate religious systems, and cultural achievements that rivaled any medieval civilization. The social organization of Great Zimbabwe was both hierarchical and meritocratic, combining inherited status with opportunities for advancement based on skill, wealth, and achievement. Archaeological evidence reveals distinct residential areas that reflect social stratification. Elite compounds with stone walls and luxury goods, middle-class areas with substantial houses and imported items, and working-class neighborhoods with simpler but well-constructed dwellings. The royal quarter, located in the hill complex, contained the most impressive residential structures, along with ceremonial spaces and religious shrines. The king and royal family lived in stone houses decorated with imported luxury goods and surrounded by courtyards designed for both privacy and public ceremonies. The architectural layout reflects a sophisticated understanding of royal protocol and the ceremonial requirements of medieval African kingship. The religious system of Great Zimbabwe was complex and sophisticated, combining ancestor veneration with nature worship and royal divinity concepts that paralleled medieval African religious traditions throughout the continent. Archaeological evidence includes religious artifacts, ceremonial spaces, and burial practices that reveal elaborate spiritual beliefs and ritual practices. The famous Zimbabwe birds' 8 soapstone sculptures found at the site represent one of medieval Africa's greatest artistic achievements. These aren't primitive carvings, but sophisticated sculptures that combine realistic bird forms with symbolic elements representing spiritual beliefs and royal authority. The artistic skill demonstrated in these sculptures rivals the best medieval art from any civilization. The educational systems of Great Zimbabwe produced skilled architects, engineers, artists, and administrators who managed the city's complex urban systems and international trade relationships. While no written records survive, the sophistication of Great Zimbabwe's achievements demonstrates formal knowledge transmission systems that preserved and advanced technical, artistic, and administrative skills across generations. The role of women in Great Zimbabwe society was significant and multifaceted, with archaeological evidence suggesting that women participated in trade, crafts production, and possibly political leadership. Burial remains show that elite women owned valuable goods and received elaborate funeral honors that indicate high social status and important social roles. The artistic traditions of Great Zimbabwe included not just the famous bird sculptures, but also pottery, metalwork, textile production, and architectural decoration that demonstrate sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities and high levels of technical skill. The pottery found at Great Zimbabwe shows both utilitarian and decorative traditions that reflect complex cultural values and artistic achievements. The agricultural systems supporting Great Zimbabwe reveal sophisticated understanding of farming techniques, crop selection, and environmental management. The inhabitants practiced crop rotation, terracing, and irrigation methods that sustained large urban populations while maintaining soil fertility and preventing environmental degradation. These agricultural achievements were essential for supporting Great Zimbabwe's urban civilization. The technological innovations developed at Great Zimbabwe included advanced metallurgy, precision stone cutting, hydraulic engineering, and architectural techniques that represent original African contributions to world technology. These weren't borrowed techniques, but indigenous innovations that solved local challenges while achieving results that impressed international visitors and trading partners. The legal and administrative systems of Great Zimbabwe, while not documented in written form, can be inferred from the site's organization and archaeological evidence. The systematic layout of residential areas, the regulation of trade activities, and the coordination of large-scale construction projects all required sophisticated governmental systems and legal frameworks that maintain social order and economic prosperity. The musical and performance traditions of Great Zimbabwe likely included elaborate ceremonies, royal festivals, and religious celebrations that utilized the site's acoustic properties and ceremonial spaces. Archaeological evidence includes musical instruments and performance areas that suggest rich cultural traditions comparable to those found in other medieval African civilizations. The medical and health systems of Great Zimbabwe produced populations that lived longer and healthier lives than most medieval Europeans, based on skeletal remains that show evidence of good nutrition, effective medical care, and relatively low levels of infectious disease. The urban planning of Great Zimbabwe included sanitation systems and public health measures that contributed to the population's well-being. The intellectual achievements of Great Zimbabwe's inhabitants included astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and artistic knowledge that was preserved and transmitted through oral traditions and practical training systems. While these intellectual traditions weren't recorded in written form, their practical applications demonstrate sophisticated knowledge systems that guided Great Zimbabwe's technological and artistic achievements. The international cultural exchanges facilitated by Great Zimbabwe's trade relationships brought foreign influences to the city while spreading African cultural traditions to distant lands. Archaeological evidence includes foreign-influenced artistic styles, imported cultural objects, and evidence of technological exchanges that demonstrate Great Zimbabwe's active participation in medieval global cultural networks. The decline of Great Zimbabwe's cultural achievements coincided with the city's economic and political decline in the 15th century. However, many of the cultural traditions, artistic techniques, and social practices developed at Great Zimbabwe continued in successor societies and can be traced in modern Zimbabwean and Southern African cultural traditions. The legacy of Great Zimbabwe's cultural achievements includes contributions to African artistic traditions, architectural techniques, and social organization patterns that influence development throughout the region for centuries. Many of the cultural innovations pioneered at Great Zimbabwe became foundational elements of Southern African civilizations that followed. Understanding the society and culture of Great Zimbabwe reveals a sophisticated medieval African civilization that achieved remarkable cultural, artistic, and intellectual accomplishments. These achievements demonstrate that medieval Africa possessed civilizations comparable to those traditionally celebrated in world history, with unique contributions that deserve recognition alongside the cultural achievements of medieval Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The recovery and study of Great Zimbabwe's cultural heritage provides crucial evidence for understanding the diversity and sophistication of medieval African civilizations. This knowledge challenges historical narratives that have marginalized African achievements while demonstrating the importance of preserving and studying the cultural heritage of all human societies. By 1450 CE, the magnificent stone walls of Great Zimbabwe stood largely empty. The bustling trade center that had dominated southern African commerce for 3 centuries was becoming a ghost town, its inhabitants dispersing to new centers of power and wealth. But what caused the collapse of one of medieval Africa's greatest civilizations? The answer reveals a complex web of environmental change, political conflict, and economic disruption that offers sobering lessons about the fragility of even the most successful societies. Climate change struck Great Zimbabwe with devastating force during the 15th century. The medieval warm period, which had supported the agricultural prosperity that fed Great Zimbabwe's large population, ended abruptly around 1400 CE. The Little Ice Age that followed brought cooler temperatures, erratic rainfall, and agricultural crisis to the region. Crops failed, pastures dried up, and the environmental foundation of Great Zimbabwe's wealth began to crumble. Archaeological evidence reveals the impact of this climate crisis in the layers of Great Zimbabwe's excavated remains. Pollen analysis shows dramatic changes in vegetation patterns. Animal bones from the final occupation period indicate increasing reliance on hunting as livestock herds dwindled. Food storage facilities show signs of desperate attempts to preserve scarce resources as agricultural productivity collapsed. The political consequences of environmental crisis were severe and immediate. Great Zimbabwe's power had always depended on controlling agricultural surpluses that could be traded for luxury goods and used to support non-agricultural populations. When the rains failed and harvests diminished, the economic foundation of the state's authority collapsed. Tributary communities stopped sending taxes in gold and ivory. Regional governors declared independence. A centralized political system that had unified the region for centuries fragmented into competing local kingdoms. The timing of Great Zimbabwe's decline coincided with the arrival of Portuguese traders on the East African coast. While the Portuguese didn't directly attack Great Zimbabwe, their presence disrupted the established Indian Ocean trade networks that had been crucial to the city's prosperity. Arab and Swahili merchants, who had maintained commercial relationships with Great Zimbabwe for centuries, found their traditional roots challenged by Portuguese competition and control. Portuguese documents from the early 16th century provide eyewitness accounts of Great Zimbabwe's final period. These sources describe a city still impressive in its architecture, but declining in population and commercial activity. Portuguese traders noted the presence of gold and ivory, but complained about the difficulty of establishing reliable trading relationships with increasingly unstable local authorities. The rise of competing political centers drew population and resources away from Great Zimbabwe during its final decades. The Kingdom of Mutapa, established in the northern regions, offered new opportunities for ambitious nobles and skilled craftsmen. The Toro Kingdom to the south provided alternative centers for trade and political advancement. Great Zimbabwe's monopoly on regional power and commerce was broken by the emergence of these rival centers. The migration patterns during Great Zimbabwe's decline can be traced through archaeological evidence at related sites throughout the region. Many of the architectural techniques, artistic styles, and cultural practices developed at Great Zimbabwe appear at sites like Kami and Denangombe, suggesting that Great Zimbabwe's population didn't simply disappear, but relocated to new centers that offered better opportunities in changing circumstances. The technological knowledge and skills developed at Great Zimbabwe were preserved and continued at successor sites, suggesting that the decline represented political and economic reorganization rather than complete cultural collapse. The dry stone building techniques, gold working methods, and agricultural practices pioneered at Great Zimbabwe continued to be used throughout the region for centuries after the original city was abandoned. The oral traditions of the Shona people preserve detailed accounts of Great Zimbabwe's final period that complement archaeological evidence. These traditions describe conflicts between royal factions, disputes over succession rights, and ultimately the decision by the royal court to abandon the site in favor of new capitals that offered better political and economic prospects. The symbolic importance of Great Zimbabwe continued long after its abandonment as a political center. The site remained sacred to the Shona people, who maintained religious observances and burial practices there for centuries. The Zimbabwe birds and other religious artifacts were preserved and venerated, demonstrating that cultural and spiritual connections to the site survived political and economic decline. The European discovery of Great Zimbabwe in the 19th century occurred at a time when the site had been abandoned for nearly 400 years, but remained important to local communities as a sacred site and symbol of ancestral achievement. The colonial misinterpretation of Great Zimbabwe as history represented not just academic error, but cultural violence that attempted to sever African connections to their historical heritage. The lessons from Great Zimbabwe's decline remain relevant for understanding how complex societies respond to environmental and economic challenges. The city's collapse demonstrates that even successful civilizations can be vulnerable to combinations of climate change, political instability, and economic disruption that overwhelm adaptive capabilities and force dramatic social reorganization. The environmental factors in Great Zimbabwe's decline anticipate modern concerns about climate change impacts on agricultural societies and urban civilizations. The medieval climate crisis that affected Great Zimbabwe was part of global patterns that influenced societies throughout Africa, Europe, and Asia, demonstrating the interconnectedness of environmental and social systems across vast regions. The political fragmentation that accompanied Great Zimbabwe's decline illustrates how environmental stress can undermine centralized authority and lead to the emergence of alternative power centers. The successor kingdoms that emerged from Great Zimbabwe's collapse weren't necessarily inferior to the original civilization, but represented adaptations to changing circumstances and new opportunities. The economic disruption caused by Portuguese interference in established trade networks demonstrates how external forces can destabilize even well-established commercial systems. The impact of European exploration and colonization on African trading networks anticipates the much larger disruptions that would reshape African societies during subsequent centuries. The cultural continuity that survived Great Zimbabwe's political and economic decline demonstrates the resilience of human societies and the ability of cultural traditions to persist through periods of dramatic change. The preservation of Great Zimbabwe's architectural, artistic, and religious traditions in successor societies shows that cultural achievement can outlast the political systems that originally supported it. Understanding Great Zimbabwe's decline provides crucial perspective on the rise and fall of complex societies throughout human history. The factors that contributed to the city's abandonment, environmental change, political conflict, economic disruption, and external interference represent universal challenges that have affected civilizations across time and geography. The recovery of Great Zimbabwe's true history, including the circumstances of its decline, provides important lessons about the complexity of historical change and the multiple factors that influence the development and collapse of human societies. These lessons remain relevant for understanding how modern societies can respond to similar challenges while preserving their essential cultural achievements and values. In 1929, archaeologist Gertrude Catton Thompson stood before the Royal Geographical Society in London and delivered findings that would enrage colonial authorities across Africa. After conducting the first systematic scientific excavation at Great Zimbabwe, she declared unequivocally, "Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans for Africans." The colonial response was swift and vicious. Her funding was cut, her findings were suppressed, and the Rhodesian government banned her research from official tourism materials. What followed was one of archaeology's most shameful episodes, a systematic campaign to destroy, hide, and falsify evidence that contradicted racist assumptions about African capabilities. This wasn't just academic bias, it was deliberate historical vandalism, designed to support colonial rule by denying African civilizational achievements. The pattern of archaeological destruction began almost immediately after Great Zimbabwe's European discovery. Early visitors removed artifacts, damaged structures, and deliberately destroyed evidence that might prove African origin. The German adventurer Karl Mauch, who first publicized the site, collected artifacts selectively, keeping items that seemed foreign, while discarding pottery and tools that were obviously African in origin. The systematic looting reached industrial scales under British colonial rule. The Ancient Ruins Company granted exclusive rights to explore archaeological sites throughout southern Rhodesia. Operated from 1895 to 1900 with the explicit goal of finding gold and artifacts that could be sold to European collectors. They dynamited walls, excavated buildings, and destroyed stratified archaeological deposits that contained crucial evidence about the site's development and inhabitants. The damage done by the Ancient Ruins Company was catastrophic and irreversible. They destroyed entire sections of the great enclosure while searching for imagined treasure chambers. They scattered artifacts without recording their contexts, making scientific analysis impossible. They removed tons of archaeological material from the site, including gold artifacts, pottery, and tools that were sold to private collectors or melted down for their metal content. Colonial archaeologists who followed adopted research methodologies designed to support predetermined conclusions about foreign origin rather than conducting objective scientific investigation. They focused exclusively on exotic artifacts while ignoring overwhelming evidence of local African development. They published theories based on selective evidence while suppressing findings that contradicted their assumptions. The career of Richard Nicklin Hall illustrates the deliberate distortion of archaeological evidence for ideological purposes. Appointed as curator of Great Zimbabwe in 1902, Hall spent 4 years cleaning the site by removing what he called the filth and decadence of the Kaffir occupation. He destroyed archaeological deposits dating from the site's final occupation period, permanently eliminating evidence about how and why Great Zimbabwe was abandoned. Hall's activities weren't just destructive, they were falsified to support colonial propaganda. He claimed to find evidence of Semitic construction techniques while destroying proof of African building traditions. He attributed sophisticated artifacts to foreign influences while discarding locally made items that demonstrated African technological capabilities. His reports were written to support tourist industry marketing rather than scientific accuracy. The suppression of African oral traditions represented another dimension of the colonial cover-up. Local Shona communities maintained detailed historical knowledge about Great Zimbabwe's builders, history, and significance. But colonial authorities systematically dismissed these accounts as primitive mythology, unworthy of serious consideration. Indigenous knowledge that could have provided crucial insights into Great Zimbabwe's history was officially ignored and actively suppressed. The legal prohibition of pro-African archaeological theories reached its peak under the THEA, Rhodesian Government Censorship Act, which banned publications that attributed Great Zimbabwe to indigenous African builders. Scientists who insisted on African origins faced government harassment, funding cuts, and career destruction. The official tourist guidebooks promoted the Queen of Sheba theory well into the 1970s, despite overwhelming scientific evidence proving African origins. The international academic community's complicity in these cover-ups was extensive and shameful. Major universities and museums accepted colonial interpretations without demanding rigorous evidence. Academic journals published speculative theories about foreign origins while rejecting scientific papers proving African construction. The racism was so pervasive that even well-intentioned scholars unconsciously excluded African possibilities from their analytical frameworks. The damage extended beyond Great Zimbabwe to other archaeological sites throughout colonial Africa. Similar patterns of destruction, looting, and falsification occurred at sites across the continent wherever colonial authorities encountered evidence of sophisticated African civilizations. The systematic suppression of African archaeological heritage was a continent-wide phenomenon that lasted for decades. The role of the tourism industry in perpetuating false theories about Great Zimbabwe demonstrates how economic interests supported racist historical narratives. Colonial tourism promoters found that exotic theories about foreign builders attracted more European visitors than accurate information about African achievements. The Queen of Sheba connection was marketed heavily because it appealed to European fantasies about mysterious ancient civilizations while avoiding uncomfortable recognition of African capabilities. The recovery of Great Zimbabwe's true history began with the work of African and African sympathetic archaeologists who challenged colonial orthodoxy despite facing severe personal and professional consequences. Roger Summers, Peter Garlake, and later African scholars like Innocent Paiki Rai conducted rigorous scientific research that gradually exposed the extent of colonial falsification and established the true African origins of Great Zimbabwe. The modern reassessment of Great Zimbabwe required not just new research, but acknowledgement of how badly previous generations of archaeologists had compromised the site's integrity. Decades of destructive excavation, artifact removal, and deliberate falsification had eliminated much evidence that could have provided detailed insights into Great Zimbabwe's development, daily life, and cultural achievements. The documentation of colonial archaeological crimes at Great Zimbabwe provides crucial evidence for understanding how racism distorted scientific research throughout Africa. The systematic destruction of evidence, falsification of findings, and suppression of alternative theories represent violations of basic scientific ethics that continued for nearly a century with full institutional support. The legal and ethical implications of colonial archaeological activities at Great Zimbabwe include issues of cultural property theft, destruction of heritage sites, and falsification of historical records that continue to affect African communities and international understanding of African history. The artifacts stolen from Great Zimbabwe remain scattered in private collections and museums worldwide, removed from their cultural context and unavailable for proper scientific study. The psychological impact of colonial historical falsification extended far beyond archaeological circles to affect how Africans and the world understood African capabilities and contributions to human civilization. The systematic denial of African